Greetings, viewers. So this is a quick overview of Chapter 10 of my text, Third Supercycle. And the title of this is Chapter 10, The Four Instigators, 1935 to 1940. Chapter starts by dispelling three of the most widespread myths about the outbreak of World War II. And these are extremely pernicious. They're very popular. They're very common. They're still around us today. There are variations of them. But they can be summarized fairly easily. Number one, first, most common myth is to blame everything on Germany. So, Germany bad, or Hitler bad. And that's the explanation for everything that happens. And this is simply not the case. This explains nothing of why Axis Germany exists, or what its goals were, or how it's able to motivate its people, and it leaves out Axis Italy, it leaves out Axis Japan, and it also leaves out the fourth of the instigators, and that was the Soviet Empire. So one of the points that the chapter makes is that it's actually the actions of four empires that start World War II, and the Soviets do play a key role, and they deserve to be labeled one of the four instigators. It's not a primary instigator, but definitely one of the four. Okay. Myth number two, very popular to this day, and that's the notion that the Axis could have somehow eked out a victory, that there's some small chance that they could have won. This is simply not the case. The Allies simply had massive superiority in terms of resources, demographics, soldiers, productivity, economics, technology, everything under the sun. The numbers, to give you comprise a lot of history into just a couple sentences. The Allies generated about 3/4 of world economic output and constituted about 60% of the world population. The Axis powers were only 20% of the world population and maybe 25% of the world economy. So they were fundamentally limited in what they could do, the territories they had, and the wealth they had at their disposal. Allies were infinitely richer, more productive, more powerful. So Allies had to win, and the Axis had to lose. The possibility of an Axis victory, this is something that many science fiction franchises have played with. The most famous nowadays, The Man in the High Castle, Wolfenstein, the video game franchise. But again, these are science fiction fantasy, and they're not very credible when it comes to history. They have to sort of invent stuff, some magic technology or some new weapon system. But then you're not dealing with history anymore, you're dealing with fantasy, things that did not happen, as opposed to the things that actually did happen. And when we look at the world of 1941, 1945, it's very clear that there was no way for the Axis to win. The only question was how much damage were they going to do before they were defeated. The third myth, also very important in our own time, and this is the myth that the Soviet Empire had absolutely no responsibility for starting the war. They were a completely innocent victim and taken by surprise, and oh, poor them. No, the Soviet Empire was the fourth instigator. And of course they suffered terribly in the war and would lose 26 million people, fearsome catastrophe, but they were an instigator of the conflict. And they actually co-started it along with the Axis powers. And how did they manage to do this? Well, the next part of the chapter goes into some of the detail about how this instigation actually happens, and basically follows and does close readings of what Axis Italy does. And the long and short of it is that Axis Italy sort of sets the model by invading Ethiopia in 1935 and discovering that the three most powerful core empires, Britain, France, the United States, do nothing. And then Axis Japan invades China in 1937, and what do the three core polities do? They do nothing. And then Axis Germany invades Austria in 1938, and what do the three core polities do? They do nothing. So what happens is there's a logic of instigator culpability, or instigator responsibility, that happens, but there's also something like core complicity. And this is basically something the historians talk about in terms of the politics of appeasement. So this notion that you give the Axis what they want and they'll stop. And of course, this was a fundamental misreading of what the four instigators were up to. One of the big problems during this time period is that the leaders of Britain, France, and the United States, they did not understand the four instigators. They assumed that they thought like themselves in terms of sort of these limited goals. And that wasn't the case. These four regimes were really bent on overthrowing the world order and creating a new world order that would suit them. They'd looked at World War I and the chaos, and they'd looked at the Great Depression and realized Britain's not running the show, so why don't we run the show? We'll invade the casino, and if we can't get anything, we'll set it on fire. That's the logic to this. So the core polities didn't understand this, and it took them a long time to learn to change their policy. They eventually would change the policy, but only after fearsome disasters occurred. So the issue of Soviet responsibility. This needs to be highlighted because this is actually something very relevant to the history happening today. One of the issues that the apologists of Putinism and Muscovy trot this out constantly as an excuse for their latest crime against the people of Ukraine, and it's absolutely not true. And in fact, there's a terrible continuity. The Soviet Empire instigates a world war, and you could argue that Putinism has been trying to instigate a world war and failing miserably because for a number of reasons. I'll quote a passage from my text just to kind of describe Soviet responsibility or instigation responsibility, the fact that they were a co-instigator. Quote, "What made the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact a world historical disaster." Now remember, this was the pact that divided up Poland between the Soviet Empire and the German Empire in 1939, and this allows Germany to attack Poland, and then Germany has the resources to attack France. So basically, everything that Germany does after 1939 is enabled by this pact, and here's why. The pact provided Axis Germany the key material inputs necessary to expand its regional war into a world war. The economic clauses of the pact obligated the Soviet Empire to deliver vast quantities of minerals and energy supplies to Germany in exchange for limited quantities of German industrial equipment. And I quote Sean McMeekin, who has a good history of this, quote, "Between September 1939 and June 22, 1941, the USSR shipped to the Reich 1.75 million tons of wheat, 1 million tons of petroleum products, 23,000 tons of chrome, and 214,000 tons of phosphate, in addition to materials transshipped from Asia and the Pacific region. 440,000 tons of rubber, wolfram, copper, tin, soybeans, and whale oil," unquote. The Soviet Empire did not just provide a third of the hydrocarbons which powered Germany's tanks and planes in its 1940 and 1941 invasions. It also fed the horses which moved its artillery and supplies. German logistics relied on railroads and horses, not trucks. And that's where my self-quotation ends. So this issue of the raw materials deficits of the Axis polities, that they were desperately short of raw materials and minerals and particularly energy, and they had to get them from somewhere, and Stalin provided Axis Germany with the materials it needs. And this makes all the catastrophes possible. So the last point that the chapter makes is a little follow-up to this, and it's not quite a myth, but it's sort of a misunderstanding of the Battle of France in 1940. And the reason for the German victory in 1940 is actually not that Germany had sort of invented this new era of completely and fully motorized warfare. That's not what happened. What happened was the triumph of a partly motorized army that seemed to be fully motorized over an army that was not yet fully motorized. And the reason that this happened was that France waited too late to rearm. Britain had been rearming since 1936. They were much more they understood to a certain extent what Axis Germany was up to and sort of rearmed. They didn't stop Mussolini, but they at least started the process. France waited until 1939, so it was far too late. And they were in the midst of their military modernization when the war happens. Historians have actually they've gone through the records and they've discovered that Germany had 157 divisions in 1940 that it mobilized. Only 16 of them were fully motorized. So what happened is that the German generals, basically took those 16 divisions and put them all in the front. So the German victory was your classic one-punch miracle. So they put all of their tanks in the front line, no reserves. They put all their planes in the front line, no reserves. They put their best units in the front line. They put all the limited amount of hydrocarbons and oil that they have in the front line, and they put everything in that one punch. And if it failed, their army would have crumbled because all they had was infantry, and then it would have been an even fight, and then the Allies could have mobilized. But this one-punch strategy amazingly worked. A year later, France might have been sufficiently motorized to stop it, but it was the right strategy at the right time. And France had also made some mistakes that it did not have a strategic reserve. If they'd had a sufficient reserve during the early days of the invasion, they could have counterattacked and saved themselves. But so 2 bad decisions on the part of France caused their defeat. So I'll stop here. The very last point to flag about this chapter is I do spend a fair amount of time discussing sort of the brokenness of the politics of appeasement by Britain, France, and the United States. And I do want to emphasize one of the things that the chapter emphasizes is that this was not because of bad leadership or Chamberlain being foolish or misguided. The deeper problem here was that all these polities were still using a 19th century playbook to understand the conquest adventurisms and Soviet neocolonial expansionism. So they didn't understand what the 4 instigators were up to, and they misread that until catastrophe was upon them. Then they changed their policies, of course. And interestingly, they started to change their policies in 1939. And the first change was, Britain starts to rearm early on, but they also changed their policies vis-a-vis the Soviet Empire, and they actually compel Stalin to stop his assault on Finland in early 1940 and put diplomatic pressure on him, and so he signs peace deal. He doesn't get everything he wanted. He wanted to actually take all Finland. He doesn't. He gets a little territory, but he has to stop. This is sort of the end of the period of appeasement and the beginning of something else. What happens after 1940 is the politics of appeasement turn into the politics of the Allied victory, and that'll be the subject covered by the next 3 talks. And I'll cover chapters 11, 12, and 13. So I will stop here.